Appreciate it. Nelson Cunningham is a former assistant U.S. attorney who served as White House counsel under President Clinton. Kim Whaley was a former associate Whitewater independent counsel and a former federal prosecutor. I appreciate both of you being with us. Nelson, what do you make of the role that Don McGahn played, that we now know he played in this White House?
He seems to have turned out to have been Donald Trump's secret weapon in protecting his presidency, because the president kept on asking him to do improper things, including firing Robert Mueller, things that clearly would have shaken Trump's presidency after the firing of Jim Comey. We all remember the Saturday night massacre under Richard Nixon. McGahn refused to do that. McGahn refused to do that and other steps that would plainly have put the president in even deeper jeopardy. I'm not sure the president understands it right now, but Don McGahn did him a solid.
It certainly, Kim, does not sound like the president understands that Don McGahn did him a solid. Do you think it can be said Don McGahn saved his presidency?
I think Don McGahn might have saved democracy in a way, because I'm not so sure that if the president had fired Robert Mueller, that the political process and the American public would have held Mr. Trump accountable. And then we'd be in a situation where you get away with the Saturday night massacre. So maybe maybe it's a good thing that it was stopped for that broader question. But sure, there were heroes inside the government that sort of put the brakes on this renegade president. And I think at this point, when it's all in black and white, 480 pages, the question is, will there be any accountability through the political process? And I think that's something that matters for purposes of our broader democratic process and democratic system of separation of powers.
Also, just the portrayal that the Mueller report gives of how this White House functions and does not function. I mean, it's long been known that, from the original setup with Reince Priebus as chief of staff, that this was not an ordinary White House setup. But just the level of dysfunction of the president giving orders to subordinates to do things that they just ignore and kind of hope he'll forget about. CNN was given a quote by a senior Trump administration official. I want to read it. The senior Trump administration tells CNN that the Mueller report isn't surprising, that it's become, in their words, the norm for the president to make, and I'm quoting here, absurd demands of his staff. How does a White House function like that?
I worked in the Clinton White House. It wasn't perfect, but it sure didn't function that way. There you had a president, and we've had presidents of both parties, frankly, until now, who, when they're told by their legal counsel, sir, this is a line that we should not cross, the presidents understand that. They might find ways to work around it. They might find ways to change the law, but I've never seen one who just blatantly seems to do as this president does. I don't care. Do it anyway. That's extraordinary to me.
Kim, you wrote yesterday that the president's actions seemed a lot like obstruction. As you've had time to kind of focus on the reflect, do you still believe that? I mean, do you and if that is the case, was it just the fact that Mueller is operating under the Department of Justice guidelines and not only accepts those guidelines, but pointed out that it would be unfair to have charges against the president if he can't be indicted and can't go to a court to defend himself?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the obstruction of justice statute is very broad. Mr. Barr got upset about that last June when he wrote that famous memo to the White House. But the fact is, if you endeavor to obstruct an investigation and the steps you're going to take are likely to make an impact, then that can be obstruction. Here we have, for example, the president directing that the head of the actual investigation be fired. That would certainly interfere with the investigation. So I think that on many levels, there's a case for obstruction, and people are talking about, well, he didn't really mean it, or he was really upset. Those are defense kind of arguments at trial. That doesn't undermine the basic case. But you put your finger on something, I think, that is a very nuanced constitutional distinction, where basically Robert Mueller said it's not fair as a matter of due process to ping someone for a crime and then not let them defend themselves in court. Since we can't prosecute the president, he can't defend himself, so we're not going to do it, which is why really the impeachment process, which is effectively a trial in Congress, is the place that the president, in theory, would defend himself.
And Robert Mueller certainly seemed to serve it up to Congress. I mean, just saying repeatedly in different ways that he's giving the evidence to those who have a constitutional mandate, a constitutional role to play in this if they so choose. We're going to talk more. Stand by. Coming up, Attorney General Bill Barr under fire for his handling of the report's rollout, including how he took Mueller's words out of context. Plus, new today, former Vice President Joe Biden is set to announce his 2020 campaign next week. what that means for the Democratic race for president. We'll be right back. Well, some Democrats are now saying it's time for Attorney General William Barr to go. They say the partisan way in which he handled the special counsel's report calls into question his independence and impartiality, including his spin on the report just prior to its release.
The special counsel's report states that his, quote, investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. The special counsel found no collusion by any Americans in IRA's illegal activities. In other words, there was no evidence of the Trump campaign collusion with the Russian government's hacking.
CNN Justice reporter Laura Jarrett has been all over this. So, Laura, if you will, just kind of walk us through the discrepancies between what Barr said or things that might have been misleading and what Mueller actually concluded.
Well, Anderson, while Barr didn't misquote the report exactly, he did fail to give a nuanced, full picture of Mueller's findings, and that's what he's really being criticized for today. So I want to just walk through three different examples that sort of lay this out. The first is on that issue of no collusion, which Barr, echoing Trump there at the press conference yesterday, said three different times, no evidence on the issue of a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russian government. But the report from Mueller actually does say this. It says, the investigation established that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and that the campaign expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts. And that's a key part of the context and really sheds light on what the Russians were doing, and that did not make it into Barr's four-page summary from last month. The second issue has to do with obstruction of justice. And on this issue, Mueller lays it out very clearly in the very beginning of Volume 2 of the report. He explains that he's accepting longstanding DOJ guidance that you don't indict a sitting president, and he explains it this way. Quote, fairness concerns counsel against potentially reaching that judgment, meaning one that would have potentially implicated the president in a crime, when no charges can be brought. So essentially what he's saying there, the president can't defend himself in court, as you were talking about with your last panel, and so I'm not even going to reach that traditional prosecutorial role. Instead, I'm going to lay out all the evidence and preserve witnesses' contemporaneous thoughts. Barr dismissed that idea about the OLC guidance yesterday at the press conference. When I asked him whether that had to do with Mueller's reasoning, he sort of downplayed it and said that Mueller hadn't talked about it when they had their March 5th meeting. But clearly it weighed heavily on Mueller's mind. And finally is this issue of Trump's cooperation in the investigation. Take a listen to what Barr said about that yesterday.
Nonetheless, the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation, providing unfettered access to campaign and White House documents, directing senior aides to testify freely, and asserting no privilege claims. And at the same time, the president took no act that in fact deprived the special counsel of the documents and witnesses necessary to complete his investigation.
Yet Mueller was not so glowing in the report when it came to cooperation. Here's what he wrote, quote, we viewed the written answers to be inadequate. And so why didn't he subpoena the president? Well, he says he had the authority to, but Mueller writes, but at that point, our investigation had made significant progress and had produced substantial evidence for our report. So the take-home answers from Mueller were not that helpful. Anderson, back to you.
What's also, Laura, important to point out is that the take-home answers were only on the question of collusion. The White House refused to have the president or the president's attorneys, more accurately, answer any questions about obstruction of justice or potential obstruction of justice.
That's
which,
right.
Is again, if you're saying that the White House fully cooperated, certainly that's one example of them not. Laura, thanks for that. Back with me now is Nelson Cunningham and Kim Whaley. Kim, I'm wondering what you make of how the Attorney General has behaved in this through his public statements?
Well, first, I want to say he did not have to release the report full stop under the special counsel regulations. And I think he deserves some credit for making that determination and making all of that public. And we're not in a situation we have to go to court to actually get the document. But Laura's absolutely right. I think it's really unfortunate that he collapsed this concept of collusion and conspiracy. Mueller was very clear in the report. This is not about collusion. Collusion is a colloquial term. It's not a term of art. Attorney General Barr is a lawyer, and he should have stuck to the law, which is conspiracy. You and I can think this was collusion. It's a colloquial, just regular term. Accepting information about your political opponents from an adverse foreign power, we could say that's collusion. In another universe, Trump and his team could have said, listen, I'm not going to talk to the Russians. I'm going to call the FBI. I'm for America, not for Russia. So that's a political determination. That's something that should have played out in the public sphere. And I think it was improper, really, for Mr. Barr to have taken that step. It would have been better for the integrity of the Justice Department and the whole system for him to just not to stay neutral, right. not be Trump's lawyer.
It was interesting how he did it, though, in a way that directly echoed President Trump's language of no collusion, which obviously you get a sense that part of his audience, if not his sole audience, was President Trump.
He was a good lawyer for President Trump.
Which
Absolutely.
Is not his job.
Well, I mean, some might argue that it is his job. My view as a constitutional law professor, I have a book coming out in June on the Constitution. That is structurally, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, a problem. We want a neutral Justice Department so that people don't pick and choose who gets prosecuted based on your political views, and the entire American public can buy into the integrity of that system.
Nelson, has Barr hurt the integrity of the system?
He is certainly pressed the boundaries in some areas. Look, Rod Rosenstein ran this investigation for 2 full years. I followed it closely. I've written about it. I cannot think of anything that Rod Rosenstein did in 2 years other than that memo he wrote that first or second night when Trump said, justify my firing of Jim Comey. I can't think of anything in 2 years that would cause people at the Justice Department to be anything but mightily proud of his leadership and the way that he handled the Mueller investigation. Meanwhile, just in the last month, Attorney General Barr has made at least 4 or 5 critical moves that cause a lot of us who were professionals in law enforcement to scratch our heads and say, why did he do that? And the answer seems to be he has a different notion of who his client is than perhaps Rod Rosenstein.
You say I assume you're talking about the release of a 4-page summary, how he did that, some of the testimony he gave.
And then waiting a month for the redactions. Did it really take a month?
It shouldn't have taken that long.
It was very convenient that it was released in the middle of a 2-week congressional recess on Maundy Thursday, right before Easter and Passover. So all of the Senate, all of the House is gone. They won't come back for another 10 days. By that point, who knows what might be on the front pages. It's very convenient to release it now. Did he do it by coincidence? I don't really think so. And then, of course, his press conference yesterday morning, we all have to wonder what was going on in Rod Rosenstein's mind as he stood there just next to and behind Barr, mute, unable to say anything, given his 2-year tenure at what was incredibly difficult personal and professional cost. And yet he acquitted himself extraordinarily well in those 2 years.
Well, it was interesting how Attorney General Barr made a point of really embracing Rod Rosenstein publicly to him. Basically, sort of one of the messages of it is that Rod Rosenstein agrees with everything I'm saying. He agrees with my conclusions. I want to thank him for all his, help in this transition. He looked deeply uncomfortable.
And you know what? Because Rod Rosenstein strikes me, I don't know him, but he strikes me as a straight down the middle, by the books prosecutor. We'll never hear his version of it. And so Barr can say what he wants to say. And I don't think we're going to hear